My name is Gailya Paliga, and I am president of the North Carolina National Organization for Women, also known as NC Now. I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker, Ashley All, who played a large part in that Kansas vote in August. Kansans were able to defeat a bad constitutional amendment in what was the first referendum after the Supreme Court took away the federal right to safe and legal abortion by overturning Roe v. Wade. Roe was overturned in the Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization decision last June. As you know, we are not advancing good policy in North Carolina. The state legislative leadership approach has been my way or the highway. They continue to block even obvious win-win legislation like Medicaid expansion. They even stop money already allocated for North Carolina. This has happened a couple times with unemployment benefits, both in 2013 when they totally slashed unemployment benefits and we lost $700 million in federal aid we already had allocated for us, and then also during the pandemic. In September 2021, they cut federal unemployment benefits early. So now North Carolina has some of the lowest unemployment benefits in the nation. Even though the state is swimming in money, they continue to starve public education and punish unemployed people, while they're giving outrageous sums of money to inappropriate programs like anti-abortion clinics known as crisis pregnancy centers, or CPCs, and private school vouchers. They gave $19 million to CPCs and a whopping $176 million to the voucher program. We need to make some progress on problems that hurt all women, and this has been true since at least the takeover in 2011. As we know, women do much worse in a lot of areas. We know some of the reasons we need an equal rights amendment are things that hurt all women, not just progressive women, and they hurt families too. Unequal pay, taking advantage of work associated with women, like teaching, nursing, childcare, violence against women, pregnancy discrimination, insufficient health care coverage, bad leave policies, as caretaking falls unfairly on women. And, to know more about these, you should watch Equal Means Equal, which is an excellent documentary. What Ashley All and her team were able to do in Kansas is avoid partisan traps and get to the heart of the issues to motivate women and allies to vote for their own interests. You can see even in the name of the organization the positive spin and appeal they would have. Kansans for constitutional freedom. For something. Freedom. Who wouldn't want that? Ashley spent her life getting ready for this campaign. She's an accomplished communication and political strategist with more than 18 years' experience working primarily in red states, including her home state of Kansas. She holds a master's degree in strategic communication from Columbia University, and she's motivated. She is the mother of 4 girls and doesn't want them to have fewer rights than she has. We really need to learn how to make some headway in North Carolina from this victory in Kansas. Our legislature has been brutal in so many ways, and we just need a giant correction. We have a precarious situation with this November election. Few races are even in play. We're looking forward to getting the inside story of how Ashley and her team won their vote. Here she is.
Good morning. Thank you so much for welcoming me to North Carolina. I'm Ashley All. I've spent the past 18 years working in political communications in my home state of Kansas and other red states across the country. This experience has prepared me well for some pretty tough political campaigns. This year, you may have heard that we had a tough fight in Kansas. We fought for reproductive rights, and we fought to protect the constitutional rights of women, and we won in a landslide, surprising many pundits and shocking the world. We protected the constitutional rights of women and learned a few things about how to win in a post-Roe world. A little background about how we ended up being the first state in the nation to vote on reproductive rights. It actually started way back in 2019, where our Kansas Supreme Court decided that women in Kansas have a right to personal autonomy, to make health decisions for themselves, and thus the right to an abortion. Obviously, that immediately set off a chain reaction that caused conservative, anti-choice legislators to try to put an amendment on the ballot. They failed in 2020, but again, after the elections in 2020, the legislature became more conservative, and in 2021, they were able to pass the amendment, putting it on the primary election ballot in 2022. The first thing to acknowledge is that the anti-abortion activists, the folks who wrote this amendment, really worked to stack the deck in their favor. From the wording to the timing to the electorate. The language itself was intentionally confusing. The name was deceptive. They called it the Value Them Both Amendment, and I can assure you that it did not value either women or children. They also mentioned several topics to confuse voters into thinking that exceptions like rape and incest were protected, but they were not. It also was placed on the primary ballot in August, and just like other states, primary elections often have far lower turnout and are more partisan. In Kansas, that usually means that they are heavily Republican, and even more so than the general election, which is already pretty darn Republican. Finally, the electorate in Kansas is majority Republican, 44%. Registered voters are Republican, 29% are unaffiliated, and 26% Democrat. Yes, Democrats are actually outnumbered by unaffiliated voters. And the other key thing to remember is that unaffiliated voters do not vote in partisan primaries. So typically that August primary, where this amendment was on the ballot, typically unaffiliated voters do not vote then. So it made it even more important for us to get the word out about the amendment. Looking back, there are several things that contributed to our success. First, coalition building. We worked really hard for the year leading up to the vote to talk to voters across the political spectrum. That meant we built bridges with groups, and we focused on working with moderate Republicans, young progressives, and everybody in between. And to do that, the campaign remained fully nonpartisan. Did county Democratic parties help us? Absolutely. But they were partners just like other groups were partners. Another reason we were able to reach so many voters with our message was funding. Early on, we struggled with funding. We were behind after our first finance report, but in the spring, we were really able to make headway, and also we were able to gain funding before the Dobbs decision, but also after the Dobbs decision. And that funding allowed us to do a whole lot of research and also a whole lot of paid communication. And we were able to research just how regular voters think, talk, and view abortion. It's a very complicated issue to most people, and to communicate effectively, we had to understand it. And we learned that the vast majority of Kansans did not see abortion as a partisan issue. I would wager to say that more Americans don't either. They see it as an extremely complicated and deeply personal issue. And the important nugget, regardless of personal views on abortion, we have a shared fundamental belief that women should be able to make those decisions for themselves, free from political or government interference. So we learned through our research that message was important, but also the messengers were important. Those insights guided our tailored message, strategy, and message throughout the summer. Lastly, we were able to communicate to a broad swath of Kansas voters. Adequate funding allowed our campaign to run ads in every market on digital, TV, newspaper, and mail, including on some conservative channels like Fox and OAN. Because you can't persuade voters if you don't talk to them. When we tested messages, we found that the strongest messages among all segments of the Kansas electorate was about protecting the constitutional rights of women to make private medical decisions free from government interference. I want to be clear. This was the top testing message among base Democrats, from the most liberal segments all the way to the most conservative segments. I clarify this because national pundits really focused on this message and how it was tailored to win over Republicans, which obviously we absolutely had to do in a state like Kansas, but we did not do it at the expense of our most loyal pro-choice voters. This message was the top testing message among base and progressive voters. This message worked with everyone, and that's why it was on TV all summer long. But we also layered in a more empathetic and motivational messages to our base on digital and in the mail to help turn out.
I would be remiss if I didn't
voters.
mention how the Dobbs decision fit into all this. We were well into our campaign when the decision came down. We knew it would probably come down before our vote. The leaked decision in May really gave us an opportunity to plan, actually, which, it was pretty awful that it was leaked in May, but also helpful to us because we were able to plan all of the things that we needed to do, the statements, the messages, the ads that would happen if that were the actual decision. And so when the real decision came on June 24th, 2022, just 40 days before our vote, we were ready. And I cannot overstate how devastating that decision is to American women and many, many others. It was a complete U-turn. Many of you know this, complete U-turn in American history, a full repudiation of settled case law. And ultimately, it eliminated the constitutional rights that women had for over almost 50 years. And so it was absolutely devastating. But also, you know what, motivational. It was a wake-up call for a lot of moderates in our state, a lot of Americans who were probably sitting on the sidelines thinking they didn't have to work, didn't have to do anything to protect their rights. And on June 24th, they found out that was not the case. That was no different in Kansas. We saw a huge increase in engagement among our volunteers. We had been averaging about 50 volunteers, just our organization, but a week, and that went to 500 literally right after the decision. And so we really saw a significant increase specifically among moderate Republican women, quite frankly. And so right after that, the eyes of the nation kind of turned on Kansas, and we were going to be the first state in the nation to vote on reproductive rights after the fall of Roe. And if we lost, that could really set the tone for the debate going forward. But if we won, that could also dramatically change the national narrative around abortion and how we win back our freedom. And I don't think I have ever in my life worked as hard or been as busy as I was during those last 40 days. And I have worked on, top tier governor's races, US Senate races, and I have never seen anything like it. I did about 130 interviews in 40 days, which is insane. And our volunteers worked around the clock and were just troopers. They knocked on, and just our volunteers I'm talking about, knocked on 40,000 doors in 40 days, made 600,000 calls, texted unknown numbers of Kansans. We spent millions of dollars on television, and we generated millions of dollars in earned media value in those last 40 days. And the outcome was spectacular. It was honestly better than I could have ever imagined. A lot of us in Kansas knew that we had a path to victory. We understood that the vast majority of Kansans supported access to abortion, but we just didn't know who would show up on election day, who would show up to a primary election at this kind of weird time, and whether we were really communicating effectively and efficiently with our voters and making sure that people showed up. And on election day, they showed up. We had, at historic levels, it rivaled, general election turnout for us. And we won in the landslide, 59-41. That's a 19-point margin, which is pretty remarkable. And I can tell you, I was in shock. I was overwhelmed that night. And, even thinking back on it right now, it's a little bit surreal to think back on. It really was probably the most, the most pivotal moment in my career to date. And I'm going to share a couple of pictures with you because, like, sometimes it's exciting to see pictures. So there's me. Those are my daughters. I have four. That is one stepdaughter and three biological children. And that is Sylvia in the stripes, Penelope in the yellow, and Georgia kind of behind the podium. And they were with me that night, and the images of that night will be kind of the memory that I have. And it's really, I'm going to get emotional now, but the relief I felt, quite frankly, and I think that many Kansans felt that night, was, pretty overwhelming. And we were able to protect the constitutional rights, the freedom, the equality of our kids, our daughters, our friends and family, in a way that maybe secures those rights in the future and makes sure that they're able to grow up with the same rights that I had and the same amount of freedom as their brother, quite frankly. And so after Kansas, we got a whole bunch of awesome headlines, and it really did dramatically change the outlook, I think, in the midterms. And that was really the question that everybody asked me afterwards, was like, how does this impact the midterms? And I tried very hard not to speculate, because who knows, we'll see in a couple of weeks. But but I've been willing to talk to pretty much anyone who asks about what we did, because I think it's really important, because we are in a different environment today than ever before. I mean, in the past, almost 50 years. And, the Dobbs decision fundamentally changed our rights and the landscape around reproductive rights in our country. And we have to adapt and do things differently if we want to win back those rights, especially in places like my home state of Kansas, states in the Midwest and the South, where there are very few opportunities or access. There's very little access to abortion, and on top of that, they have legislatures who are out of step with the values of their constituents. Sounds like North Carolina is struggling with the same thing. We have not expanded Medicaid in Kansas either, and so we have to look for different ways to communicate, and different ways to win. So in the months since the vote, we really have learned kind of a little bit about who showed up. And first, as I mentioned, the turnout was historic, equal to a general election in our state. Second, the electorate was overwhelmingly women. Over 55% of the voters in the primary were women, versus like 44 and some change that were men. That's pretty remarkable. And we also had the most significant turnout ever among young voters between the age of 18 and 34. Those folks tend to not show up, and they, still not at the same levels as some of our older voters, but significantly better than previous elections. And another interesting fact is that the Kansans who were voting for the very first time, had registered, and this was their first outing as a voter. 75% of those folks were women. So even after working in politics for 2 decades, I really would say that this probably was, I learned so much this year. And I think we all really do need to rethink our approach in a post-Roe world. The Dobbs decision fundamentally changed women's rights, equality, reproductive freedom in this country. And we really have to adapt and figure out new ways to win. So, some broad themes on the lessons we learned in Kansas. First, we have to meet voters where they are and not where we wish they were. And this was something that coalition partners really struggled with. And we all have very, sincerely held beliefs about this issue and many other issues. And sometimes it's hard to not realize, to recognize that not everybody feels that way. And even folks who may, support access to abortion, that means very different things to different people. And so we have to work to persuade them to join us. We can't just stomp our foot and demand it. we have to work and have those conversations, really to bring them over to our side. As I mentioned before, support for legal abortion is nonpartisan. Despite what pundits say at the national level, despite what politicians say, there are a lot of Republicans, unaffiliated voters, independent voters, whatever you want to call them. There's a lot of folks across party lines who support access to abortion. And that was made evident in Kansas. A lot of moderate Republicans showed up and voted no, and really protected those rights. And so we have to figure out a way to avoid partisan language and frames that we typically use around this issue. Again, coalition building is so important. It means, bringing more people to the table and not fewer. And that means accepting people who may have complicated views on abortion, but still ultimately support the right to choose, or at least they support politicians and government staying out of your business. And I'll take that too. If they are willing to give me the right to make my own decision, that is really all I need from them. Ultimately, in conservative, and I would say right now in a voting situation, but we have a lot of work to do. The work that anti-abortion folks did over the past decades, the communication work that they did that, put us in a situation where Roe was overturned, but also put us in a situation where there's incredible stigma around abortion. There is incredible stereotypes about who gets an abortion. We have to work hard over the next decade, probably, to unravel all of that, all of that misinformation that they shared for so long, and that'll take a lot of time. And the last thing I want to say is we have to talk to everybody. If we win, we cannot only talk to the folks who we agree with. We have to talk to folks who may not agree with us or may be on the fence about some things. And that is when the change and the change can happen. Specifically around the messaging, one of the things that I mentioned this earlier, we did a lot of research to figure out how people see this issue. And the important thing that I would say is we have to be able to find common ground and a shared value that a broad set of voters support. And that can be freedom, as I mentioned, reproductive freedom, equality. It can be protecting constitutional rights. But we have to find something that allows people to have their own personal views on abortion, but also, allows them to still join us in the fundamental belief that people deserve the right to make those decisions for themselves. And those things are critical. If you push people away, even amongst pro-choice voters, I would say that means different things to different people. And if you insist that you're only going to allow people who narrowly defined are pro-choice the way you define it, then you are excluding folks and making it harder to win back those rights. We have to make the coalition larger. And also, the thing that I always struggle with is clarifying the facts, but don't get lost in the weeds. The more we fight about details, the more I did a lot of work with reporters to clarify the misinformation and the lies that were happening in our campaign. There were lots, believe me, but I did it in a way where, I really helped reporters off the record and on background understand the law, what it was, what the current state of abortion access in Kansas was. And then when I went on the record and delivered quotes, I was able to really focus on the much broader and more powerful message of freedom and protecting constitutional rights. We have an incredible opportunity after the win in Kansas and coming up in the midterms. And your Secretary of State mentioned it earlier, and I agree. I think women have the opportunity to change our country and save our country, and change our states, our home states, for the better. And my hope is that young women and new voters in Kansas continue to show up and realize that they made the difference, and it really does matter when you show up to vote. And I think the opportunity that we have goes to the fact that in a post-Dobbs world, after Roe fell, voters very much understand what's at stake. We saw stories in the news about women who had healthcare delayed or denied. We all saw the story about a 10-year-old who was forced to travel over state lines to obtain an abortion after being raped, was put through further trauma. Americans understand that we lost constitutional rights that we had for 50 years, and people are motivated. And so we should harness that. Young voters and women really do have an opportunity to make a huge impact in upcoming elections. As I mentioned earlier, 55% of the people who showed up on August 2nd in our primary election were women. And I can guarantee you that that contributed significantly to the margin that we won by. And I would also say that in conservative states, I have worked in Kansas most of my life, done work in some other states, some other conservative states as well. And sometimes we get overlooked because people just don't think you can win there. And I would say we can absolutely win. I mean, we have a Democratic governor, just like you guys do. And the majority of voters support access to abortion. And if we work together and we try, we can definitely win there too. And again, legal support for legal abortion is nonpartisan, and Americans across the political spectrum will show up and really vote for those rights. I want to thank you all for coming and listening today. I really enjoy the opportunity to talk about Kansas all the time. It's something that sometimes Kansas, over the past couple of decades, has been ridiculed and made the news for not great reasons. And this was, so exciting to really, demonstrate to the country that a broad and diverse group of voters in the state support women's rights, and really, I think, give people hope at a time when it looked pretty dire for a while. And so for me, it was probably the most rewarding work I've ever done in my life. So again, pleased to be here with you today. And now my favorite part of the day, which is what I do all day long, usually in my day job, which is answer questions. I will do my best to answer as many as I can. Believe me, if we don't get through them, please connect with me afterwards. I'm going to do a couple that are very different messengers and different audiences. And I want you guys to see kind of what you think about
that no parent should have to make. I had a 3-year-old son at the time and a husband who needed me to be very much so alive. And if I didn't have an abortion, they would be without their mother and their wife. But if this constitutional amendment passes, no one in Kansas will have that choice. It could ban any abortion with no exceptions, even in cases like mine. That's my story, and I'm not alone. Vote no.
So as you can see with that ad, that was one that was on television, broad audience, like broadcast television, for a good chunk of the campaign. It was, I think, our second ad. Actually, it was our third. So our first one was an ad that was called Mandate, and there was not a speaker, and there was just voiceover, and it talked about, it was kind of like a foundational ad that talked about the amendment, what it meant, that it was it would mandate government control over our private medical decisions and pave the way to a total ban on abortion. And then the second ad was an ad with a doctor who talked about his ability to help patients would be impacted by this law.
Do no harm. That's the oath we take as doctors. But now the government wants to force doctors in Kansas to break that oath by passing a constitutional amendment that could put a mother's life at risk. It's a government mandate that could ban all abortions with no exceptions, even rape and incest. It's dangerous, and it ties the hands of doctors in Kansas. On August the 2nd, I'm voting no on the amendment because I took an oath. Do no harm.
And the third was this ad alone, about a mother who obviously hadn't had a choice, but had really no choice. It was something that saved her life. And that was something that we played for, it was on for a while, but it was also on rotation for like the duration of the campaign, because it was a message that, really made clear the real world implications of this constitutional amendment. The next one I want to play is let's do the one that's SCOTUS.
Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade. And Kansas is voting on an amendment that's nothing more than a backdoor ban on abortion. All eyes will be on us as we decide whether we trust each other to make the right decision, or if we're going to side with politicians in Topeka who want to pave the way for a total ban on abortion without exceptions. It's time for us to fight back by voting no on August 2nd.
If a friend asked me to drive her to get an abortion, I would say yes. Every pregnancy is different, and I'll never know the whole story. And I don't want to force my beliefs on anyone else. But that's what this new amendment on the ballot would do. It's a backdoor ban on safe, legal abortions. I trust the people I care about to make their own decisions, not some sneaky politicians. I'm voting no, and I'm telling my friends to vote no too.
Did anybody have any guess as the difference in, it's young women, exactly. So the first ad was like a very broadly targeted ad to all, like Republicans, anyone that was on TV. That ad was a digital ad that was specifically targeted to younger women, more progressive voters, and it was like the goal was to motivate turnout in a way that, some of the other ones might not. So you can see how just like the difference in tone, it's still the same message, still talking about protecting our constitutional rights, preventing politicians in Topeka from, taking those away, but it was definitely a different tone and different kind of message delivery. It's just on our YouTube page. If you go to the YouTube page for Kansans for Constitutional Freedom, there's a whole bunch of ads on there that we did. And you can see that there are some that are very much, focused on fact checking the other side's misleading comments. There are some that have let's play the pastor one, because that one's like kind of one of my favorite, because this guy, I did a podcast with this guy early in the summer, and he was like my spiritual leader through the whole campaign, because he's like the sweetest, most lovely man. But it also shows you, how you can use different messengers to really disarm some of the more conservative opponents of a bill like this.
As a pastor for over 50 years, I counsel and pray with individuals facing difficult personal decisions. Sometimes those conversations are about abortion. As Christians, we are instructed to love one another. We do so when we respect and trust women as God does. I'm voting no on the proposed amendment because it replaces religious freedom with government control. It restricts women's rights, and it puts their very lives at risk. Join me and thousands of Christians in voting no.
Man.
Yeah, he's my favorite, but that was a great, and what's interesting about that, I said that we did a lot of research. The one thing that we were really fortunate to be able to do was ad research, ad testing. And what that means is, you make all these ads that really drive home your messages and use different messengers in different ways. We had the pastor, we had the patient, the doctor, a grandmother, a Republican dude, we had all these different messengers. And then there's a way where you can present them to voters and see which ones move people the most. And unfortunately, the pastor didn't move. It wasn't as impactful as some of the other ones, which I was surprised by. But it was really helpful to learn. We still released it. We still used it on TV a little bit, but it wasn't as heavily played as some of the other ones. But the key with messengers is people have to identify with the people that are speaking in the ads. They have to identify with the story. And so we used a lot of different people who had different connections to the issue of abortion. Whether we know somebody who had to make that decision, whether we had to make that decision, whether we had loved ones who have gone through miscarriage or had a difficult pregnancy or life-threatening complication. We all have personal experiences. Men and women have personal experiences with pregnancy, and ultimately they all understand how complicated it is. And so if you can get people to a place where they identify with the story and why it's important that we protect these rights, you really can make a lot of headway with a lot of different voters. Because I mean, there's a reason why polling says that, like, I think it's like 70, depends on how you ask the question, 70 to 80% of people in the US support access to abortion. I'm gonna stop talking and we can do some questions but the ads are fun.
Okay. Yes, and I think I put a link to, like, I have the article about you, and then I put a bunch of ads in there, and then like I love Stephen Colbert had that. Yes, we can.
Yeah.
So cool. I had read a lot, and can you talk about their, like, the name of their campaign and why it was misleading? One. And then it looked like a specific religious group was on the other side in a big way. Can you do that?
Yeah, so first, so they drafted this. They were able to write, I mean, they were in control of literally everything, which is funny because after the election, then there was a lot of backtracking, how the wording was confusing and all of this stuff. But it was like, you wrote the amendment the way you wanted it. And I'm sure that they did some testing to see if the language worked in their favor, which it did, probably at the time with nobody else talking about it. Yeah, so they were called the Value Them Both campaign. The amendment was named the Value Them Both amendment. And for literally 2 years, we talked about the way that the reporters reported on it was value them both. And so from the very beginning, that was kind of a challenge for us. Like, how do we talk about this amendment without, reiterating the same name that they created that's damaging to us? And so we really talked about it as a ban, as a backdoor ban, as an amendment that opened the door to a total ban on abortion, which it did, because abortion's already pretty heavily regulated in our state. And so, that they did a lot of work to, mislead and deceive voters. And that was my job. My job was to go on TV and disprove them, or to offer a different perspective and talk about the law. So that we did a lot of work on that. I think we were pretty successful. The misinformation was kind of ongoing throughout the entire campaign. Even like a last minute text message was sent out the night before the election. And so it was kind of constant, but we were definitely able to push back. What was the second part of the question? I'm sorry, I got.
So it looked like specific religious group was.
Yeah. Okay. So the vast majority of the funding in Kansas came from the Archdiocese, the Catholic Church. Most of it was from Kansas, like Kansas City Archdiocese, I think Oklahoma as well, Wichita. So a lot of their money, we're talking of their $7 million budget, I think it was probably over close to 6 of it. I mean, the vast majority came from the Catholic Church. And so I think that's complicated for a lot of reasons, but and disappointing for a lot of reasons. But the interesting thing is that was something that we really spent a lot of time trying to kind of make it clear that that not all people of faith, not even all Catholics, are opposed to abortion. And so that became really clear. We worked with Reverend McKell, who you saw in the ad a minute ago, and there were probably we released a list of like 65 clergy who were actively working with us to oppose this amendment, and they were in their communities talking to their to their congregations, and really being additional messengers, because people trust their faith leader, and so that was really helpful. And there were a lot of this is a funny story, but I won't say who it is, but I was at a function with my husband not too long after the election, and one of his colleagues came up to me, and we were all talking as a group, and then everybody kind of wandered away, and it was just the two of us, and he said, "I will never say this publicly, but myself and my wife voted no. We're Catholic, we are in that community, and everybody, a lot of people were voting yes, and we voted no because we have, we don't think that it was the right approach or whatever." And he thanked me for what I did. And I think that he's probably not alone. There are quite a few people who may have said that they were voting a certain way and then didn't when it came down to voting day. But it shows you that, like, we shouldn't discount groups of people because we think that they might disagree with us. We have a lot of opportunity to connect with so many different groups of people. And especially in our country now, it's very divided. But part of overcoming that, I think, is having conversations, being willing to have conversations with people who are different than you, and also who may disagree with you a little bit. I mean, it's scary to have conversations like that, disagreements, but if we come to it from a place of respect, and really share our personal stories, and why this is something that we think is important, often you'll find that people are share a lot more than they have a lot more in common than we tend to believe.
Can't unmute there. That's all of it. It's so cool. Matthews asks, were you able to bring healthcare providers into your coalition, like doctors, nurses, midwives, and their association? And if so, did that help?
Sorry, yes, I'm just getting rid of my daughter. She was texting me, and I don't know if you could hear that, but it was really loud. We were able to work with a lot of providers. In fact, I think we released a list of like 400 or 500 doctors that were opposing the amendment. And quite frankly, it could have been more. We just kind of ran out of time. so we did it. We collected those names in probably like a 2-week period, which if we'd started earlier, we could have probably gotten way more. But that was something that, they put an ad on television that had, several doctors that talked about how, this amendment was just fine. But the vast majority of I think the medical, community really opposed this amendment. And at the same time, this was like right after Roe, there was a huge outpouring of statements and comments from national organizations, National Organization of Gynecology and Obstetrics, all of those different organizations who were talking about like the real world implications of these laws and these bans. And we saw it on TV. We saw people, being pushed up into the, close to death in order before they were able to make these decisions and perform an abortion. And that's not where people are. That's not where the vast majority of Americans are. They don't want to put women's lives at risk.
And children.
Exactly.
Jennifer Albright had asked about the research that you did. Did partner organizations conduct research individually? And like, what kind of methods did you use for polling?
So we were the lead organization, and we did the fundraising, and we did the research. I think there might have been, I'm not sure if any of the smaller organizations did, but we did the vast majority of it because it is, I don't know if any of you work in marketing or politics, but market research or polling is really expensive oftentimes, and that's why a lot of people don't do it. And the research for us was kind of served two purposes. One being it helped inform our messaging, it helped inform how we were going to spend the money we had effectively to communicate effectively. But the other part was really helping coalition partners understand where voters are. And I think that this goes to, like, regardless of what issue you're working on, what sector of the economy you work in, we all kind of get immersed in our own, in our own space. And when you only work on, reproductive rights around people who agree with you, that impacts the way you think about it. And so we really had to help some of our partners see that, yes, there were really people out there who think women should die if they don't, or if, I mean, if they can't get an abortion. I mean, like, we have to understand, they have to understand that the values that we have are not, are not necessarily completely identical to the ones of the voters who are going to show up. And so, and that goes to what I said earlier, which is we have to meet voters where they are. We can aspire to bring them, to educate them and bring them closer to our ideal and our values, but that is a long-term project. A campaign is not, it's just not the vehicle for that. I mean, like, we have to do long-term education programs through, national long-term education programs about what abortion is and what it isn't, and all of that, all the things that they did for decades, we have to do as well. But a campaign is very specific. So we did all the research, and that was why, we built this big coalition. It started with the 5. It went to probably 50 different organizations, and we had weekly calls with the steering committee, which the steering committee was like much more like local organizations. One was called Mainstream Coalition that works with moderate Republicans. Obviously, local Democratic parties also were on our steering committee and were on those calls. Catholics for Choice. I mean, like Women for Kansas. I mean, this huge network of groups, and we provided. We did presentations on the research. We helped them with guidance on talking points. We provided like the infrastructure and the walk lists and all of that, so that they could do the work that they do best, which is organizing in local communities and being the trusted messengers in their, with their neighbors. And so that was our job, and the research really, I think, informed so much and really helped us learn so much about Kansas voters, but also I think, broadly speaking, American voters and where they are, just regular voters, where they are on this issue.
Okay, great. And we appreciate your insight and your time. I'm trying to get back to a question on privacy. Somebody was asking how effective, okay, this is Laura Flicker, who I think is from Durham. How effective is messaging around privacy for today's electorate, that being the original implied basis for Roe?
For us, it wasn't particularly motivational. I mean, I think the thing for us was, we were able to look at what the amendment did, and it was stripping rights out of the Constitution. It was eliminating rights for women, and that was something that was much more motivational than privacy. I mean, ultimately, we kind of had a little bit of that in there because we talked about people ought to be able to make their own private medical decisions without interference from the government. So there was a little bit of that, but it was much more about protecting constitutional rights, protecting our freedom. And you know what? Like after I started reading some of the research throughout the campaign, I was like, why? I basically was like, I'm done, ceding those issues to Republicans. Those freedom, equality, all of those issues are not Republican issues. Or Republican values. They are American values. And I think we have made a mistake in letting them own them the way they have. And so for me, I talk a lot about protecting freedom and women deserving the freedom to make their own decisions. And that was much more, that was much more motivational for Kansas voters. And I saw a question in the chat about whether I think that this would work in other red states. Yes. And I think it would work in a lot of places, not just red states. Because as I mentioned earlier, this was the top testing message among Democrats and like base, progressives, the folks who are, with us on everything. I mean, and we gave them many options, different messages that we thought, like as liberals, whatever, we thought they would, maybe gravitate towards. And they really, I mean, they were pretty good, but this one was far better. Because if you think about it, equality, freedom, constitutional rights, those are, the right to make your own decisions about your body. That is those are progressive and democratic values. Those are pro-choice values. You know, like if you think about some of the older taglines of "My Body, My Choice," "Bands Off My Body." I mean, it's the same thing. It's just formed in a way that is more accessible to a broader set of voters.
Great. This isn't phrased as a question exactly, but I do think it's really interesting. Wendy Mishner, who lives in Durham, is asked or said, "The election maps I have seen do not give credit to how split the vote was in traditionally Republican counties." And, you know, do you have insight into that?
Yeah. So my past 18 years, I've done candidate campaigns. I've worked on probably 6 different statewide races in Kansas alone, 2 governor's races that we won, which is pretty good for, you know, a red state. Kathleen Sebelius, who ended up being HHX secretary, was the first one. Laura Kelly, the second. But I also worked for an attorney general's race in 2006. That was my first kind of statewide race. As well as a U.S. Senate race, which we lost, and another governor's race, which we lost. You know, you can't win them all, unfortunately. But yeah, typically in Kansas, Democrats win like 5 counties. I mean, they're the most populous counties, and that carries to other states. You have like the little blue dots around where like Chapel Hill or wherever, you know, college towns or whatever, and then the more urban areas. Same in Kansas. You know, we have like the Kansas City metro area, Johnson County, which is like growing significantly. Wichita, Lawrence, where I live, which is a college town. You have those kind of 5 counties, and at least in the last probably 15 years. And we won 20 counties, like pretty handily, won 20 counties in August. But in addition to that, and many of them were rural counties, but in addition to that, we had a lot of counties that were like very, very close, like 50-50. You know, I mean, we won one of the most like far western counties in the state. We won by like 100 votes. I mean, it's just like there was a huge shift, and it shows that like it does. Again, this isn't a partisan issue. People understand the importance of being able to A, make your own decisions about your body, and B, protecting women and giving them and doctors the opportunity to make these decisions, because pregnancy is complicated and can be dangerous. And I don't think that people in rural communities don't understand that. In fact, they may understand it better because hospitals are, hours away. And so, it really was, it really did cross party lines in a way that I was not expecting. And I think that could be true in a lot of states. Like we'll see, I'm working for a new organization called Families United for Freedom, and it is focusing on ballot initiatives in states across the country as a different way to win back access. And instead of just electing candidates or that then have to vote a certain way, we are going to look at ballot initiatives. Kansas was a kind of interesting one. There's one in Kentucky that's very similar to Kansas. My friend Rachel Sweet, who managed in Kansas, is managing in Kentucky. And, it's an interesting, I think, fingers crossed, but I think we're going to win that one too. I mean, it's the same thing. We're defending, preventing them from putting in the Constitution that there is no right. So it's not an affirmative, but it is, definitely protecting rights. So we're working in Kentucky. Michigan is an interesting one because it's, a swing state. There's a lot going on, and it is an affirmative yes vote to add, basically to restore the rights that they had under Roe to their constitution, which is great. But there are other states like Montana and Vermont and California, and those are great. I'm so happy that they're putting it in the constitution of Vermont and California, but they already have very safe, and very good laws for access. But there's a lot of states who have the opportunity to use ballot referendum to bypass gerrymandered legislatures or legislatures that are out of step with the vast majority of the population. And so we'll be looking at that in the next couple of years to see if there are opportunities. I mean, just around Kansas, there's Oklahoma and Missouri that have the opportunity to do that. Other states, Iowa, I think Pennsylvania was someone that has reached out. There's a lot of states that have the possibility of changing and protecting rights at the state level.
I want to say that I think you missed my point. This is Wendy.
Mm-hmm.
And my point is that there was counties that you did not win, but this was a statewide referendum, which
Mm-hmm.
means that it doesn't matter you didn't win that county. If 44% of the people in that county voted voted no,
Right.
they counted. And that's what I'm not seeing in the electoral maps. I'm not seeing all those counties where you lost, but
Mm-hmm.
you still won.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the challenge. That's a challenge in a lot of states, is like, we always have to kind of run up the number of votes that we pick up in more urban areas. But you're right. I mean, if we do better in rural counties, 44% is way better than 15%, which is sometimes what we get. So you're right. I mean, it makes a huge difference in the outcome.
And okay, so I know you have to go, and we appreciate you so much.
It's okay.
No. So you heard me talk about the Equal Rights Amendment, and I don't know how much exposure you have personally to the Equal Rights Amendment. So let me just check that first. Do you?
I know some. Yeah, I know some about it. I'm not probably following as much, where it stands right now. But I know there's a lot of interest in working on it to make sure that it's just another way to equalize and make sure that there are protections for folks regardless of gender or gender identity.
Okay, well, I would say there's this awesome documentary, Equal Means Equal, by Kamala Lopez, which y'all might want to watch just to see like the real, how bad things are for women and girls around the state. Because somebody has a question about stuff about getting the ERA passed now that 38 out of 38 states have, and I don't know if you're gonna, I'll ask it, but I think it might be not for you. What message would you suggest to educate voters to demand the Biden administration publish the ERA as the 28th Amendment? Because we have 38 out of 38 states that have ratified it.
Mm-hmm.
And Trump told the archivist not to publish it, and he didn't. And so I think this isn't your question, but
yeah, I'm not familiar enough with it, but I know it's important.
Yeah,
But
okay.
no, I'm not as familiar, and I'm also not as familiar with the rules at the federal level and how to get those things done.
And Lori Bunton's specifically going to talk about this kind of stuff. This is her. Okay, and so I would say our last question is kind of perfect. Our friend Marla Barthen, who's calling from Wilmington, wants to know, will you write a short how-to guide? It's a good question.
Yeah, so there is a lot of work underway. We also did post-election research, which often doesn't get done to kind of figure out what things worked and what things didn't. And so there is an effort to really like do a deep dive into what we did, what things worked, suggestions for how to structure coalitions, all of those things that are kind of like in the weeds in some ways. The cool things that I talked about, like messaging and research, that's fun. But sometimes like it really, like how you structure a coalition is just as important to the success of the amendment, how it's worded. I mean, a lot of those things are really important. So yes, I mean, no, I'm not going to probably write it alone, but I do think that we're going to try to provide as much information as possible, because that's how, sharing that information is critical to making sure that we can replicate it, or we can, and I would say that every state's different. So like even knowing that like Kentucky was a little bit more conservative and we had some thoughts and ideas about what messaging would work there, we still tested it with people from Kentucky because they are different and they have different, cultural experiences than people in Kansas. And so you have to still do that. But honestly, like, I mean, I think that there are some real lessons to be learned about the messaging that we used. In fact, like right after the election, there was I don't know if anyone paid attention to, I think his name is Pat Ryan, who won a swing, kind of an unexpected swing. I didn't even know there were swing districts in New York, but apparently there are. But it was a swing district in a special election, and he won. And one of his great ads was about abortion. And it starts. You should look it up. Maybe I'll try to find a link and send it to you all. But he was a veteran. It talked about his, it was all dramatic veteran, fighting for freedom, all this stuff. And then the tone changes and he looks at the camera and he's like, and that means women's freedom too. And it was fantastic. And he won in a district that was much more difficult and I think was unexpected. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities around that message, even among real progressive voters. I think it's something that we should think carefully about because, again, as I mentioned, everything changed in June. I mean, any research that was done prior to Dobbs, anything that we thought we knew prior to that decision should probably be thrown in the trash can because it was all a theoretical debate. What might happen if these bans went into place? We are living in that reality now, and we have to figure out and adapt to the best ways that we can win. Because, yes, there are states that have great laws that protect women's rights, but there is a very large group of states, Midwest and the South, Upper Midwest too, where it is a crisis right now. There are women who have zero access. And even before Roe, I mean, if you remember, Texas lost it, has been out without access for over a year. And so we really have to remember that this is not, this is a crisis that we need to address, and their women's lives are on the line. And we can't ignore the states that are red.
I have to say, to me, it seems like it's so much worse now than it was pre-Roe because what they let go through from SB 8, which was insane. And we're going to have we were going to do this as part of the conference, but we're doing it as a separate event now, talking about unexpected ramifications of Dobbs and what's going on. And so keep your eyes out for that. The other thing is last night, I'm just saying, we had a training on the abortion pills that are available that people can get from other countries and do at home by themselves, because it's political reasons that people aren't supposed to do this. They're safe medicines and they're available. And so people can go to plancpills.org, for example, and see what I'm talking about. Or there's the Vessel the film talks about them. I mean, there are, especially also in North Carolina, 90% of counties don't have abortion clinics now. We have 15 or 16, but they're mostly in the big cities. And so, people can't get off and can't get access even before losing. And there are other options. And so those things are all helpful to know, but we agree with everything you say. And this has been so inspirational and informative and fascinating. And, we're so honored and thrilled to have you. So
thank you. I was honored and thrilled to join you. It's fun to talk about Kansas. It's also fun to, hear about other states and learn how we really can share information and learn and make a difference all across the country. Well, Thank you for having me. I'm going to go spend the rest of the day with my daughters, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.